So, patriarchal age, we're talking about 1800 BCE, we're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the thing to take away from last week's talk is that, in fact, if you don't have Bible, if you don't have Jewish Torah, if you don't have the book of Genesis, there is no other place you're going to read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which leaves us open to the question of, did this stuff really happen, or did the Jews make it up at some later date? And part of what we did last week was I tried to show that, as far as I'm concerned, there's enough circumstantial corroboration that these events took place. I can't promise you that what Abraham said on any given day is for certain. I mean, absent a position of faith, I'm talking about from a historical point of view, there is nothing you can point to. There's nothing extra biblical I can point to and say, see, these events actually are corroborated. This is what Abraham did. This is where he traveled. This is who he spoke to. This is the cave he bought in Machpelah. I cannot show you that. On the other hand, when we describe the life of the patriarchs, when we describe their travels from Ur of the Chaldees up to Haran at the height of the Fertile Crescent, down into Canaan, and then visiting Egypt when they get into trouble in famine in Canaan, those events can be substantiated. The people's names cannot be, but the travels, what they wore, their family relationships, their inheritance rights, all the things we read about in Genesis can be corroborated extra-biblically in tablets found in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, between the rivers, the Tigris-Euphrates rivers. Those are contemporary civilizations to the patriarchal narrative, and they corroborate these events. Not that Abraham took this trip, but that other people made that same trip. Caravan trails that were followed visiting Egypt in times of famine. Okay. And the same thing goes for the Exodus. We talked a little bit about that. And again, there's nothing in Egyptian history that I can point to that tells you 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60 with their families, with their flocks, which is practically the entire population of Egypt in that time. Not just slaves, but the entire population of Egypt left Egypt and traveled through the desert for 40 years because we can't find anything in that desert. Of course, the answer to that is it's a big desert and we may not have found it. But nothing in extra biblical history, nothing in Egyptian history or the surrounding peoples, they are going to come in contact. If you read in the book of Exodus, during our travels, we come into contact with different nations. Those nations never record that contact. And it's not like they're not writing them. It's not like, well, this is before history is being recorded. That's not true. We've been writing since maybe 3000 BCE. And this is 1800 BCE, 1600 BCE, 1700 BCE. This is in the full light of recorded history. And yet, nothing is recorded by anyone except us about these travels in the Exodus. So that's pretty much where we left off. On the other hand, I should add this quickly, as is with the patriarchal narratives, we went over, and it's in the outline, we went over specifics, the names being used, the place names, the places where the slaves were settled, the places from which they were working. All of that is recorded in extra biblical history, in Egyptian history. It's just the specifics are not. And then the question comes up, when did the Exodus take place? Well, here again, we have numbers, but they're only, if nobody talks about the Exodus, obviously, but us, obviously the numbers are only from our book of Exodus. We have numbers that give us a hint about when the Exodus took place. So, for example, in Genesis, it says that we were in Exodus for 400 some odd years. 430 years. In Exodus, it's 480 years. Genesis, 430 years. But it doesn't tell us when those 400 years begin and end. It just gives us a time frame of about 400 years. And it's a big assumption. The assumption is that in our Torah, we are being given the total time we lived in Egypt. So where's the beginning, where's the end? Well, we have some hints. In the book of Kings, it says that Solomon, we think, was in 966 BCE, Solomon's kingdom. And it says that in the 4th in the fourth year of Solomon's reign, it was 480 years from the Exodus. 400 years between. But you see how dicey this gets. Can we be sure when we talk about Solomon that we're talking about the year 960? No. That too is only recorded in our Torah, in our Tanakh. Solomon is only recorded in the Book of Kings. Not recorded anywhere else. As big as his kingdom was, and as wealthy as he was supposed to be, you'd think somebody else would have written something about him. Nothing. We have no evidence that there was ever a King Solomon except in our book. But if you make that assumption that there was a King Solomon and that he ruled in about 966, and you make the assumption that Genesis says we're there for 400 years, then you get a date. You subtract the 400 years from the 966, or in this case you add it because we're on the other side of the thermometer, and you come up with a date in the 1400s. Okay? Okay. So there is an assumption. In Chronicles it says that we were there were 12 generations between Solomon, or actually the priest who reigned during Solomon's reign, Zadok. There was 12 generations between the priest of Solomon and David and the Exodus. 12 generations. Well, that's a big help. 12 generations. How long is a generation? Well, typically, a generation in Bible is 40 years. So 12 of those would be 480 years. We can deduct it from King Solomon and King David about the year 1000. And you see now we're talking about 1480 BCE is when the Exodus occurred. So we have one that gives us about 1400, another 1480. But you see the assumptions in the circular reasoning and why this wouldn't hold up in any academic class of history. Because the first assumption is that the Bible 400 years is accurate, and that these other assumptions, 400 years from Solomon, 12 generations, 480 years from Solomon, all pushing us back into the 1400s. A generation is actually, 25 years, right? I mean, you think about your children, a difference in generations is 25 years, not 40 years. By 40 years, in those days, people already had grandchildren. That's 2 generations. So if a generation is 25 years, and there's 12 generations between Solomon and the Exodus, we're in the 1300s again. Okay? Where can we look for help outside of the Bible? Well, we talked last week about the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, the Semites who came down from Canaan and conquered Egypt. The year was about 1720. This would have been a fertile period for Joseph to become governor in Egypt, where Semites would rise within the hierarchy of Egypt. So if that year is 1720, and we know that from history, and we're there for 400 years, something we don't know from history, we are just assuming from our Bible, that puts us in 1320. And I've started to list the date. I did list all the dates up here, and I want you to, as I'm going through this, you can see the list. Okay. So the Hyksos, 1720, we're there for 400 years because Genesis says we are. Deduct 400 years, you got 1320. Okay? All right. Now, there was another interesting event in Egyptian history in about 1320, and that was, there was a pharaoh. By the way, any questions, just interrupt. So did I see a hand go up? No. Okay. There was an interesting event in Egyptian history, and that was Aten was the sun disk, a god. Stuart Granger, no. Michael Wilding was the, is it Wilding or Wilder? Michael Wilding was the pharaoh. And the movie is The Egyptian. I think it's from the 50s. Anyway, there was an interesting period in Egyptian history, and that is monotheism took over in Egypt. Now, it isn't a monotheism like Judaism or Christianity or Islam, but it's a kind of monotheism. The sun disk replaced all the other gods in Egypt, and it was a revolution. And